I'm not much of a theologian, but I engage these texts. There's two aspects to the way we engage these texts, and the one that I predominantly focus on is a historical engagement. In that, I'm very interested in trying to understand the history of Christianity in the first centuries. What went on there? How did that work? That became such a extremely worldwide phenomenon. What was specific about that early Christian movement that was so fundamentally important? The other aspect to engaging with these texts is, of course, a more theological one, which comes from a certain faith-based conviction. And I don't really know where I stand in that. But talking to students, I often point out that there's a difference between, well, let's put it this way, that if you're looking at these books and you're looking at engaging with them from a faith-based reason, if you believe that God is involved in history and if God is involved with God's message for humanity, then you also just need to take a certain kind of step of faith to assume that the text that God wanted people to read as the Bible would end up in the Bible. And that's not a historical argument. It's not a very academic argument. But it seems to me that if you want to engage with the divine in that way, that you then also need to make certain assumptions about the way that God reveals God's self.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Tom DeBrain, and I want to note up top, I mispronounced his name in the last conversation I had with John Dunn. I think I pronounced it the way it looked to me at the time, and this is why I asked the guests before we start the interview how to pronounce their name. So it is Tom DeBrain, in spite of how it might look to American English speakers. Now, that said, this is a very fun, interesting conversation, as they all are. But I don't think anybody's doing the work that he's doing. I don't think anybody's doing the research doing into fan fiction as a way, like an angle of entry into understanding how texts were incorporated into communities, understood what the boundaries around those texts were in early Christian and Jewish communities. And that's what this book is about. So we talk about that. Obviously, I have to call out the fact that the conversation meanders because it's Jared. But yeah, this one is interesting. So just kind of get your brain thinking about canon and all of that kind of stuff. As always, if you want to suggest guests, if you want to give me feedback, reach out to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Tom DeBrain. Tom DeBrain, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Tom DeBrain. I am South African by way of the Netherlands, by way of the UK. So I've lived in many countries. And I'm currently an assistant professor in Ancient Judaism and New Testament. Before that, I've been a lecturer in the UK of New Testament and early Christianity. And I've worked as a pastor for many years besides that.
So a lot of irons in the fire.
Yeah. A very confusing CV, you could say.
Well, no, it seems like it flows pretty well. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to be discussing your book, Fan Fiction and Early Christian Writings, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and Canon. This was one I think people were talking about, or I was seeing stuff about it at SBL in 2023, and I'm really excited that I got to get a hold of a copy from the publisher, and I'll make sure I shout them out in my introduction and in any posts I make about this. But just kind of diving in, what is fan fiction and how does it help us understand biblical texts or religious texts at all?
Yeah, so fan fiction, I think, has become more and more well-known and popular in, let's say, the last couple of decades. Basically, it's been something that's been around for quite a while, and I'll talk a bit about the history in a second. But it's where fans of some franchise, be that, let's say, Star Wars or Star Trek or My Little Pony or Supernatural, so TV shows, can also be of books, of films, that they go out and they write their own fiction based on that thing that they really love. And this fiction is written for a community of fans to enjoy, to share, to talk about, get feedback. And it's a really long process. I mean, it's been around for a very long time in that we can really talk of fan fiction in this very modern sense. Like in the middle of the previous century, when there was a lot of Star Trek fan fiction based on the original series with Kirk and Spock, that series. But it really took off, I think, with the internet era, because now we can share it much more easily. So there's big fan fiction websites like Archive of Our Own or fanfiction.net, which have, I want to say, tens of millions of fan fictions of varying length, from like three sentences to an entire novel. It's all out there.
And so
that was half of the answer, I think.
Well, you can keep going if you want to get.
No. I forgot the rest of the question. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think it's an interesting category that I experienced for most of my life as like a pejorative. It's not real. It's not legitimate. And I think that may track over to how people will understand, because there's just three categories in the subtitle of the book: Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and Canon. I think most people's engagement with biblical texts comes through canon. Is that just about orthodoxy and something being like prescribed or signed off on, and the other two are not?
So I think that's quite a common view on that you'll see specifically in, let's say, religious settings, but also in quite a few academic settings, where there's this idea that the canon, let's say the 66 books of the Protestant canon, that they are somehow better, more important, inspired, for whatever meaning of inspired you happen to believe in. But even for people who don't take them as a religious text, people will talk about them being texts or more well written. They have more literary value or more theological value. Whereas we have hundreds of these texts that didn't make it into the canon from ancient Judaism, from early Christianity, which are extremely similar to the text that ended up in the canon. For many of these, it could have been, could have not been if they ended up. There's this looking down on the things outside of the canon, which is not actually something that would be historically justified. So if we go to like 1st, 2nd, 3rd century Christianity, the concept of canon as we have it now in the 21st century didn't exist in that way. It in that respect, it does overlap a little bit with fan fiction, of course, because there is this idea of, there's a pejorative idea about fan fiction is not real. It's these fans who have too many like emotions regarding their fandom, and they go out and create these things, and people kind of look down on them, which is something similar to how a lot of people look down on the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha or other texts that didn't end up in the canon, which is an interesting overlap, which really started me on this journey of looking at fan fiction and then what I call parabiblical books, so texts that didn't end up in the canon.
I know a contemporary instance of fan fiction that ends up becoming kind of more widely adopted or accepted, rather, is was it 50 Shades of Grey that was Twilight fan fiction at first?
Yes.
Okay, so in that case, commercial viability was the thing that it was like, did you know this was, and like fan fiction is supposed to be bad or garbage or less than, but but this is succeeding, and that's our metric. Were there other metrics in the ancient world?
Yeah, I mean, so the ancient world was not as commercial as our world is, and it wasn't as capitalistic as our world was. So I think the overlap between what fans appreciate in text and what ancient cultures would appreciate in text, that is actually quite large. Because if we're looking at ancient cultures, they're going to be interested in things of like emotional connection. And is it interesting to me? Is it useful for my interests? In the case of early Christians, for my religious interests. So they would have thought along the lines of, I have this text that I'm reading, let's call it the Apocalypse of Peter. Is it something that is interesting to me, that I like, that makes my my religiosity or my connection to the faith, does it strengthen it? And those are things that they'd be really, really interested in. Whereas, of course, right now in the 21st century, we're really interested in making money, which is a very, very different thing. And if you look in fan cultures are surprisingly non-commercial. There is quite generic hatred amongst fans for 50 Shades of Grey, because they took something that was created in this non-commercial space and moved it into a commercial space. And from a capitalist point of view, it's seen as a victory or some kind of success story. But from a fan point of view, it's a betrayal of everything that fans stand for, which is a place where things are given freely, received with thanks, shared amongst each other. It's very, in that respect, kind of anti-capitalist. And P.D. James kind of went against that. So you do see a lot of hatred, or hate, let's call it that, a better term, hate towards the actions that she did by changing some names and then publishing it and making millions.
Which, I mean, congratulations to her. But obviously there are communities of people, or there is a community of people who would really like that to remain theirs rather than it just be hers.
Yeah, and of course they contributed to it by giving feedback, by suggesting edits, there's a lot of labor that goes on in fan communities, which is free. But now that she's earning a lot, all the people who helped her edit her books don't get anything for it.
So another potential, because I kind of want you to untangle this knot.
Yeah.
Another potential fan fiction author who I think said she was and then said she wasn't is Anne Rice. And I think I knew about these books, but I didn't realize there was that much behind them. But the Anne Rice Jesus books.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing, because Anne Rice is, of course, a very famous vampire novelist. Most people know Anne Rice. She grew up Catholic, but then kind of said goodbye to her faith. And then quite late in life, she decided to rekindle her faith and decided to write 3 books about Jesus's life, using her skills as a novelist to write what I would call fan fiction about Jesus. And she ended up only writing 2 because she became disillusioned with the church after a while. It's a bit of a complicated story. But she wrote 2 of these books, and they are basically a retelling of much of Jesus's life with a lot of freedom. So there are bits that she borrows from other early Christian texts, from various apocrypha, but there are also bits that she just makes up. There are also bits that she borrows from, like, let's say, Catholic orthodoxy, so like the virginity of Mary and all of that. So a very strong Catholic theology is in parts of it. But then also stuff that at least I haven't seen anywhere besides there, and that is that, like, Jesus meets Philo, who's a famous Jewish philosopher, roughly contemporaneous with Jesus's life, and kind of is tutored by Philo, which I haven't really run into anywhere. So I think that's just something Anne Rice made up. But it's this interesting thing where she has written, and they're quite long novels. They're like good thick books of like the life of Jesus, especially the first books about the first 12 years, which from canon we know like basically nothing. And she, of course, mentions the few things that are in canon, but then tells a whole lot of other things, gives Jesus emotions, gives the people around him emotions, imagines what it would be like to be a young child discovering that you have like a divine nature. So it's quite interesting. I wouldn't say I recommend anyone to read it, but it's quite an interesting book. But what for me was really interesting is that she writes an entire reflection on the book itself. So she writes an afterword in it where she says that she wants to be true to the Gospels, and she wants to present. She kind of takes a dig at New Testament scholarship, who create all these different types of Jesus, the historical Jesus and a gay Jesus. I don't know what she means with the gay Jesus, but she mentions a couple of these like those. And then she says, but that's not her goal. She wants to write about like the real Jesus, Jesus of the Gospels. And in doing that, she imagines so much around it that is not in any of the Gospels. So there's like this very strong tension between this desire to be true to the text and there's a desire to want more and desire more and think, well, this can't be all the story we have. And that is a very fanish way of thinking about text. So fans are, of course, very involved in the text, very invested in the text that they love, but they also want to have more and they create more around it, which is exactly what drives fan fiction. So Anne Rice is a useful example that I use throughout my book. Most of the chapters begin with a discussion of some aspects of Anne Rice's book, because it resonates. It's a contemporary example that resonates very strongly with what I think is exactly the same thing going on in earlier centuries, where people know stories about Jesus, be those canonical or non-canonical stories, and just want more, and then end up writing more and expanding the stories, sometimes focusing on a few details that they know from other texts, sometimes just completely running with it and giving us new novel stories that explore new things in new ways.
And so where somebody like what Anne Rice or even Christopher Moore, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Lamb. So it's the life of Jesus as described by his best friend, childhood friend Biff.
Yeah, I know the book. I've never read it, but I know of it. Yeah.
It's really funny. I do recommend that people read that
Yeah,
one.
okay.
Um,
I do have a copy. I just haven't actually read it. I haven't made it around to it.
It's fun, and it's a very I think it's a very human depiction of Jesus and of this made up character. But those are instances of like separate works, and there are instances in early Christianity where there are separate works, but then there's also what seems a little dicier because like fan fiction for Star Wars, they're not going into Disney Plus and adding scenes to the end of movies. Like they might put something on YouTube, but they're not doing anything to the actual work themselves. But then there are things like the ending of Mark that you do bring up in the book that there's a little bit of consideration that needs to be paid within this lens of fan fiction, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, a big problem a big difference between contemporary production and ancient production is we live in a world where copyright exists, which of course it didn't exist in the first century or the second century. So we live in a world where we imagine people have ownership of texts, which is not something that we would be able to trace very clearly into even 500 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago. And also production of the texts is quite well guarded and policed. So as you say, I can't go and create a new Star Wars story and get it on Disney Plus because I don't have access to that means of production. In the ancient world, there of course were some limitations because you had to have like money to buy parchment and things like that. But it seems like there was a little bit more direct access for people to create things that were very similar to the other products out there. How would you in the first century tell the difference between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas, assuming that one came before the other? There isn't really an easy way to do that. And there would be no one around to say, well, this belongs in Disney Plus. This gets to be in Disney Plus and this doesn't. So the first century is a lot more murky, and the second and the third, of course, as well, where it comes to once a text is created, you don't have this question that we would have, like, is it legitimate? Because there isn't such a clear divide between legitimate and non-legitimate texts, if we were to put it that way. We do also need to keep reminding ourselves that when we're talking about the first 4 centuries of Christianity, people are still developing the idea of a canon as such. So there isn't even this, we see this all throughout various writings of the time. People are arguing, well, these texts are good and these texts are bad, but they're not actually discussing it from the concept of canon yet, which we take as a given when we talk about most things, including your example with Star Wars. Disney Plus is kind of the canon, the collector of the canon. In contemporary Bibles, you've got a binding that binds the canon together. None of this exists, and this idea doesn't exist as such either, really, that much. So it's not people saying, oh, well, I like these canonical Gospels, I'm going to write another one. What's going on is there's people who are saying, I like these stories about Jesus that are going around, I'm going to add one. And there's no way of knowing that the stories that are going around, if those were original or not for those people. They don't have access to that kind of information. They just know of the Jesus stories and are contributing to them. It becomes more of like something what we might call like folk tales or something like that. That's kind of the context that you need to be thinking about, which makes it very murky. But fan fiction does give us a nice lens for that, because it does help understand why people would make these changes. But yeah, the example of Gospel of Mark, which one of the chapters is about, is a very interesting one, where we have, as far as I can understand, and I think this is correct, that somewhere in the 2nd century, someone decided the ending of Mark wasn't good enough and wrote a new one. And that one became so popular that it's the one that was in. It's the one that's everywhere. It's in the most of the manuscripts. It's in every Bible translation. You'll always have the longer ending of Mark with the snake handling and the drinking of the poison. Sometimes in brackets nowadays, but still in every single Bible, which shows that then it was, let's say, easier to get into Disney Plus than now.
That's that's a good way of putting it. I know. I mean, that's how I was introduced to it. I think the first Bible that I owned as an individual was an NRSV, and that was in there. But I was also just peripherally aware of a controversy that I think was probably, we'll say, 30, 40 years old by the time I had gotten a hold of that Bible. And there were people, like, as verses are just completely removed, or at the very least, I guess best case scenario for some of these people, just identified as these are not in any of the earliest texts, but we're leaving them in there because you're used to it. There's some conspiratorial thinking around that. And it seems like that goes back to this concept of ownership. So I wonder if a further distinction can be drawn between the way that ancient people, and that could be the way that, Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity both, or just early Christianity, would understand the biblical text is not theirs. Like, not even, like, let alone the capitalist kind of understanding of, like, oh, this individual owns this IP, but also, like, it doesn't necessarily belong to the community or the tradition that's the people's, which I feel like is kind of a Protestant thing. That's kind of what I was brought up with. But it's more that it belongs to the tradition in the same way that we do. Am I off base on that? I know that was a long walk.
No, it's a question I've been thinking about, and I don't have good answers for. It seems to me that there must have been some kind of sense of ownership in the communities for the texts. I'm just thinking about, like, imagine you from Corinth. Surely you have some idea of, like, well, I have sense of ownership towards the letter of Paul to the Corinthians. somewhere along the line, if we're looking at the letters of Paul, for example, somewhere along the line, these churches kept these texts, these letters, and eventually they somehow got collected into a collection from different churches. So there must have been some kind of ownership. There's also one example that springs to mind, which is oh my goodness, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Tertullian. I hope I'm not lying here. Tertullian talks about one of the apocrypha that are to do with Paul, and he says, well, that's clearly a fake. And he says, oh, we found the person who wrote it, and they wrote it out of love for Paul. But in that thing, it becomes clear that it seems like Tertullian, as like some kind of representative of the church, feels that they have ownership in some way of the letters of Paul. And there's a little bit of some hints there that it seems like, well, we own Paul and you can't have Paul. That seems to be what's going on a little bit there. But I haven't really found good answers to this. And it's a really intriguing question to wonder, does a community feel that they own or have the right to defining what a text is and how it is used? And I haven't found very good evidence for this. It doesn't mean it's not out there, but I just haven't found it, and is something that I've been wondering about, and did want to write about in the book, but then didn't because I just didn't have a whole bunch to go on.
So it's interesting that you bring up Tertullian. I've been, as with all books, slowly working my way through Kyle Hughes' Scripting the Sun. And so his whole thing is prosopological exegesis of Hebrew Bible passages by early Christian thinkers. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just bringing that up so people know I'm not I'm not taking credit. That was nowhere in my brain. But it's been tough for me, having grown up as it's a very it's a very simple thing to understand, what these things are. But I bring that up because it seems like what they're saying is, oh, everything is supposed to point to Jesus. And so they start reading biblical texts through, and I know this isn't production of biblical text, but this is now casting the light of, oh, this is Jesus. Like this dialogue is the Father and the Son. And they start developing an understanding of Trinitarian theology from that. And it doesn't seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is too far away from the approach that someone would have to say, I'm going to add something here. Basically, that it's not a bad faith thing in either case.
Yeah, no. No, so I'm just trying to think how to lead into what I want to say. Yeah, so there's this idea that one of the major founders of fan studies talks about, Henry Jenkins talks about, there's a continuum between frustration and fascination. So fans are fascinated with the text, they really, really love it, but they're frustrated because it's not doing the things they wish it would do. And I think this is quite a useful way of looking at the way that Christians engage with, let's say, Jewish or Hebrew Bible texts, in that they really like the stories about Abraham, say, but they really wish that Abraham would like Jesus a bit more. And the Hebrew Bible is great, but it doesn't seem to mention Jesus enough. And one of the examples I give in my book is from a pseudepigraphon called the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, which is a collection of the last words of the sons of Jacob, so Joseph and his brothers. And this text goes through and tells the advice and reflects on the life of each one of the 12 brothers, but then also manages to make all of these brothers Christian. So they all end up saying, well, most of them end up saying, oh, and we're looking forward to the day when the Messiah will come and he will come to earth and be baptized, and give very strong Christian things. There's very clearly Christian aspects. And it seems to me that this is similar to the more very obvious thing that's going on with early Christian exegesis of the Hebrew Bible, is that they're reading these texts. They have this love for these patriarchs, these people from the Hebrew Bible, which we have great stories about, but they really just wish they were a little bit more like into Jesus. So they add these Christian aspects to it. And this idea of frustration and fascination helps think about that, I think, in quite a useful way, that they're really fascinated by Joseph, but they're frustrated that he's not sharing the exact same faith that they do. So they change his faith and kind of baptize them into Christianity after the fact.
When does that stop? Like, how long does it last that people are open to take that kind of liberty?
What kind of liberty?
Well, I mean, I guess if it's creating something and considering it scripture.
Yeah, well, the problem is, when do people start considering something scripture, as in the contemporary meaning of scripture? So, and that's a very difficult question to answer. There has been this production of text, and the production of text continues on. I mean, it doesn't stop in ancient era; it continues into the medieval era, and it continues on to nowadays as well. Right, that people are producing text based on these things. As through time, Christians in general had a more of an idea. Well, this is our text. This is our canon in some way. We see. I think that's when you start getting this divide. But where that actually is depends on people. I would say some communities in the 4th century, like it starts, and when does it end? Very, very late. If we look at manuscript evidence, we don't find a New Testament, like a manuscript of the New Testament, so a codex of the New Testament with just the 27 that Protestants consider canonical, Catholics as well consider canonical, until I think it's the 10th or the 11th century. That's our first actual manuscript that doesn't have anything added or have anything removed from the 27. Which doesn't say that they were discussing those things all the way up until then, but it is interesting that all of our major New Testaments from the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th New century, at least, have a different collection of books than what we would consider canon. In other words, I think there's quite good evidence to say that there was a great diversity amongst Christianity for most of the first millennium when it comes to what books are in and out, or which ones do we want to consider scripture. Some more obvious, right? So the 4 Gospels, I think most people would have agreed on very, very quickly. The letters of Paul, though those differ sometimes, also quite quickly, but things like Revelation, things like the Shepherd of Hermas, those ones were much, much harder to pin down. And so you get something like the Shepherd of Hermas, which isn't actually about any of the other. It's a new story. It doesn't actually tell you more about Jesus or any of the apostles. So it's not really fan fiction in that way, but is quite clearly, early mid 2nd century. People identified it as late as well, but still thought it might be useful to have in the canon. A lot of there was conversations about this going on for a long time. Is it useful or is it not? So the conversation at first is not, is it canon or not? And definitely not, is it inspired or not? Because that's a much, much later, talking like post-Reformation kind of time for that. But the question is it useful? Or is it in some way heretical? Does it contain teachings that go against things? And this is just so hard to track. And I think a lot of people come to this question from the idea of there is a canon, there is scripture with a capital letter S. because that is the post-Reformation way that most people engage with the Bible. But that doesn't actually resonate with early Christianity very well, and it's I think it's becoming increasingly clear in the last couple of decades how much more complicated the whole process was that led eventually to a canon than anyone really thought or wrote about.
Do you think when you started studying these things, you started from the point of view of an understanding of the canon as like a whole and complete thing, and then you kind of had to start to pick that apart, like the history of how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up Christian, and Protestant Christian, so you grow up with this idea of canon. You grow up with a theology of inspiration, but also a theology of canonical like inspiration, right? So the book itself, and I guess that's building on the reformers. The book itself is enough, and those 27 are there for a reason. If I'm talking about the New Testament, 66 for the rest. Those books are there for a reason, and they are it, and everything else is not it. Which I think took quite a lot of getting used to, thinking of it differently, and engaging with these ancient texts and trying to understand that there's a completely different worldview or a way of thinking about these texts back then. And that, I mean, definitely took me a while to change the paradigm about these texts. So moving beyond this idea of, well, they're canonical and non-canonical, to these are texts that grew up together, and some of them ended up in the Bible and some of them did not. But at the beginning, they grew together, and maybe some of them are chronologically later. But in the early centuries, it's very hard to tell any kind of difference between them, except for that some are more common than others or more popular.
Has what you learned in there, has that helped you broaden personally what you might engage with? Like, so if you started out as a Protestant, that means 66 books. Do you consider more books now worthy of engagement as biblical texts?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I'm not much of a theologian, but I imagine that there's I engage these texts. There's two aspects to the way we engage these texts, and the one that I predominantly focus on is a historical engagement. In that, I'm very interested in trying to understand the history of Christianity in the first centuries. What went on there? How did that work? That became such a extremely worldwide phenomenon. What was specific about that early Christian movement that was so fundamentally important? The other aspect to engaging with these texts is, of course, a more theological one, which comes from a certain faith-based conviction, and I don't really know where I stand in that, but talking to students, I often point out that there's a difference between, let's put it this way, that if you're looking at these books and you're looking at engaging with them from a faith-based reason, if you believe that God is involved in history, and if God is involved with the God's message for humanity, then you also just need to take a certain kind of step of faith to assume that the text that God wanted people to read as the Bible would end up in the Bible. And that's not a historical argument. It's not a very academic argument. But it seems to me that if you want to engage with the divine in that way, that you then also need to make certain assumptions about the way that God reveals God's self. And in some way, you could then choose to trust the process and trust that the process was led in some way. But I would never suggest hiding from the fact that it's very, very messy, and that the canon didn't just fall from heaven straight into the hands of Augustine or something like that. It's a complex process, and the way that some people want to look at how the canon functions or works, I don't think is a very helpful one, even in in faith-based or theological environments. I don't think it's very useful to imagine that these books in the New Testament were set apart and were always unique and special and immediately recognized as such, because that is just not true, and then you're selling them short. But you can say, well, people discussed and fought about this for 2,000 years, and this is what rolled out. Let's assume that there is some kind of leadership in that.
I think it's interesting that I was raised to believe that what we were teaching and thinking about, nope, it's these 66 books. That's a very simple answer, but it's very reductive, and it almost doesn't take the Bible or biblical texts as seriously as I think they deserve. I think, especially for people who this is belief. There can be mystery here. You can say, I don't know. You don't have to have an answer, but they kind of, we kind of cordoned things off in a way that there wasn't a whole lot of room for mystery. And it was like running away from doubt. Whereas engaging with mostly academics on this podcast, I think the major benefit to me has been, I can say I don't know. And then I can look to, a book like the one I mentioned earlier, where it's talking about what Justin Martyr or Tertullian, or I can look at what your book says, which is just it does seem like this stuff is heresy from that old point of view. But I don't feel like I'm in danger anymore going into it saying I can read this book or talk to its author and walk away saying, man, there's still some stuff I don't know. Whereas before I felt like I had to walk away from biblical text or Bible study feeling like I had to know all the answers. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I don't know if that's what I'm saying, but I do. It does resonate with me. Growing up conservative Christian as well, and I think it's, for many things, a lot more interesting not to know than to have answers. For a lot of these things, it's much more fun to struggle with the questions than just to have every answer for everything. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect that I think is also important to note is that whenever people say, "Oh, I only do the Bible," or only the Bible, it's never only the Bible. So much of it is post-biblical tradition. So much of it is various theologies developed through, and you can often trace them back to certain church fathers, but they're theological innovations from much, much later. You see this all over. One of my other academic interests is Satan and demons. So I do a lot of research into Satan and demons, the developmental idea of Satan. And most people's, most churches' ideas of what the Bible says about Satan is actually not really easy to find in the Bible, but is all based on 2nd and 3rd century innovations, where we can trace this in history, that no one sees this until this guy, let's say Origen. Origen is the first person in history to say this thing, and almost all Christians then immediately agree, and that's what it is. And so there's this idea from it's biblical, but it's often not, or not quite as biblical as they like, or definitely not as self-evident from Scripture as they would like it to be. But yeah, the conclusion, absolutely. I like the questions, and I think that's a lot more interesting than having all the answers.
There are a couple of recent guests that I've had on where I've had to ask a similar question to this one, and it's kind of the effect of okay, so we want to encourage people to learn more about the people who produced or initially received biblical texts. So, there are plenty of ways for them to learn about those people. Now they need to take that back into their reading of biblical texts. How would you describe the process for kind of refining your ability to read those texts to benefit from what you learned, like over here learning about history or languages or whatever?
I think the biggest thing that I would like to, to challenge people with is to check their assumptions. So we take a lot of assumptions into the biblical text. Some of these are theological or religious assumptions that because of where we've grown up or because of the culture that we've grown up in. Others are to do with ideas about how things work. So that we import our ideas of justice into the Bible, our ideas that are based on, late Renaissance thinking in Europe about justice has defined our justice system, and then we take that and we apply that to the Bible, which has a different justice system. We take our assumptions about all manner of things, fundamental rights, freedoms. Most of these things are strange to the cultures that engendered the Bible. But we go into them and we automatically just assume that our culture is their culture, and we don't realize that there's this 2,000-year gap between these texts, being the text being me and the text being scripture. So I see this also often with students that just are not even aware, and that's one of the things that I try to then do as a professor, is to help them understand that they're not even aware of all of their 21st century assumptions that they're taking into these texts about everything, about how does society look, what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is the role of woman, what is the role of men, what is the role of children, how should we treat enslaved people. All of these things just automatically get imported without actually thinking about it. And it's very, very difficult to start to constantly challenge, well, is this something that is here, that is going on contextually back then, or is this something that I'm bringing into this text? And I think by taking that extra trouble of trying to understand what's going on culturally, religiously, historically around these texts, or in my case, literary around these texts, right, about the literary landscape of the time, you get a better feeling for how these things can happen, and also what they mean in a way that is not defined by you, but is also defined by the culture and the context of the time. Of course, you can't do away with all of your presuppositions, and of course, presuppositions are generally also not necessarily a bad thing, but it comes back to that having that answer. If you keep having the answers to all the questions, you're never actually open to seeing if it actually says something completely different. And the example of my book with fan fiction helps maybe think slightly different about why are these texts so fluid back then? How can it be that someone just adds a bit to Mark, or the section in John, the very, very famous section in John where Jesus with the stone, with the woman found in adultery, which is also probably a later edition. But if you take that out of Bibles, people get really, really upset. It's a very, very famous story about Jesus. But I think maybe if you think slightly differently about how texts came about in the time, that you think, well, it's not that, it feels maybe differently than if you just think, oh, texts are like they are now, someone writes and they get printed and they can never change. Whereas if you think about it in the ancient world, where people change texts all the time and they write things by hand, and it's normal to leave in bits or leave out bits, or to fix things, then you get a different understanding to how the text comes about, and that hopefully lets you adapt more to the fact that your favorite verse has been removed from the latest Bible.
the helpful component of the fan fiction thing, for me anyway, is this in the same way that fan fictions exist within communities. And so people, like, yeah, you may be going on online to read it, but even if it's just the comment section, you're participating
Yeah,
in that
yeah,
text. And I think it may be helpful to see biblical text as a thing that, if you could, like you said, get away from our modern understanding of publishing and see that you are a participant in the text, not just like bound to what bound like a book is, I guess.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, and also like people engage with the text often nowadays individually. So people go home, read their Bible, do Bible study, sometimes in groups, but also a lot of it takes place individually. Um, that would have been a completely strange concept to the ancient world where everything happened in communities. The texts were read as a group, for a group, always. So that's also a very interesting just way of thinking about these things, that we approach these things from an individualistic culture that back then didn't exist in that way, and we read for ourselves. And back then, you actually mostly read for groups. Um, so you process text differently, you engage text differently. You know, if someone's standing up and reading to 12 of you, just reading like 10 pages from Mark, it's going to be a very different way of engaging with it than doing a Bible study where you read a chapter or a few verses and think very carefully about them. Or even, you know, go to church and hear a sermon about a short piece of scripture, because no pastor is going to say, well, we're going to be reading the first 7 chapters of Mark today as our scripture reading, because people will be up in arms. But we consume the text also much more piecemeally than people would have back then, individualistically and in parts.
But that is where churches that have a lectionary as part of their liturgy,
Mm-hmm.
I think, do preserve more of that tradition. But it does tend to be more bite-sized chunks, and then the
Yeah,
homily
yeah.
should be derived from there.
It's often like one pericope at a time. And the feeling I get from early Christianity is that it was section. It was a good section that you would hear. Um, Pages, not lines.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine at some point, maybe it took a day, maybe it took longer, but like, Phoebe shows up to Rome, and they were reading Romans, right? Like someone was reading Romans to
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
And again, maybe
Phoebe.
it was in more than one sitting, but Phoebe's reading Romans, and the idea of going to, whatever the closest church to me might be, and today they're going to read Romans to you, like that would be
Mm-hmm.
that would be kind of bizarre.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Romans would probably take a good 40 minutes to read. I think it's around about that length. Uh, so it's not unthinkable to sit down and listen to Romans. The Gospel of Mark takes an hour and 3/4, hour and a half, hour and 3/4. So it's like a movie. We happily go to a cinema and sit through like 3 hours of Marvel's latest thing. Um, but the idea of listening to Mark seems very strange to us, to just hear it in one go. Um, but it's very doable. An hour and a half is not a long time to listen to something.
You in trouble? You okay?
I think so. Yeah. No, it's
Um,
an ambulance, which is sad news, probably. But
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe they're just rushing to get dinner.
yeah,
Let's hope they're
let's
misusing
hope.
the siren. Hey, so it's not a thick book, but there's a lot in it, and I know that there's a
Yeah.
lot that I didn't bring up. So, is there anything that I didn't bring up that you were hoping I would ask about?
Um. Well, maybe a little bit about the some of the things that I found really interesting was the way that people try to keep. So parts of it is about fan fiction, and parts of the book is about how fan communities work, and looks at aspects of how communities try to keep people out of their community that they don't like, which of course resonates with any community we're in, because all communities try to keep certain people out by definition. And there were some really fun overlaps between how fan cultures, specifically portray people that they don't like in their group as either too female, too feminine, or too childish. And this resonated very strongly with some of the things that I knew quite well from early Christianity as well. I mean, most famously is Paul's calling his people in his church children, and the things where he says, like, I used to drink, milk, but now you should be having meat. But you still these childish children. And that goes on in fan communities as well. So there were some really fun things that I discovered that show the way that early Christians seem to be trying to get rid of undesirables in their community without immediately going towards, oh, they're heretics, but like portraying people in a certain way in the hope that they either change or go away, which I thought was very interesting. And then maybe one other thing, the very, very last chapter talks about the way that everything you read creeps into your brain. So once you've read a fan fiction, whenever you engage with the original text, that fan fiction is still going to be in your mind and is going to influence the way you see that original text. And this is, of course, also true for the Christian texts. That's true for us nowadays as well. If you go read a whole bunch of Apocrypha, it's hard to read Mark and not imagine the Apocrypha in the background as well, and think about the things that you read out there. So there's this this creep from the Christian world, the story world, all of these stories together, which we also have in art and things like that, that seems to be affecting the way that canon is read as well, which I think is a very, very important and interesting concept, where you think about the fact that even though somewhere along the line someone said, oh, well, the Gospel of Thomas isn't canon, some of the things in there still ended up in people's brains as if it's in the Bible, even though it's not. And the example I give for that is the Christmas stable. If you ask anyone, what's at the Christmas stable? Well, they'll name some things, and eventually they'll name the ox and the ass. And there's no ox and the ass in the canon, but they're all over the Apocrypha. And we can see quite clearly when that was added. Like historically, we can see the innovation, the authors who made these things up, and they've become basically canon. No one imagines the Christmas stable without animals, even though there are no animals in the biblical canon. So that's quite an interesting thing to think about as well, because then so many people say, well, and we talked about this a bit earlier, like, oh, I stick to the Bible, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that has actually crept into the Bible, and the Bible is a much more murky and difficult concept than just the actual text.
The stable, if I'm remembering correctly, the presence of the animals was interpreting like prophetic statements from the Hebrew Bible, in the context of Jesus, and then rereading the nativity story through your rereading of Hebrew Bible prophecy, and that's how you end up with animals, right?
Yeah, so there's a passage in, I think it's Isaiah, which says the ox knows his master and the ass does not, or something like that. I can't remember the exact page. I'm not a Hebrew Bible person, so I'm very bad at remembering them. But there's this passage in the Hebrew Bible that has an ox and an ass, and the one knows God and the other one doesn't. And Origen links that passage to the Christmas stable and to the birth of Jesus. And he says, well, if we look at the birth of Jesus, some people, the Christians, recognized their master, and some people, the Jews, did not. And he links then both the one animal to the Christians and the other animal to the Jews, and then talks about, it's quite anti-Semitic, how terrible the Jews are that they don't accept Jesus. So just gets pulled in there, and there's not necessarily a very strong link, except for the word that manger is in there's a manger in Isaiah, and there's a manger in the Christmas stable. That's the only obvious link between the two texts, and they get linked, and then you just keep seeing this animal everywhere. And nowadays, well, you'll see, like, if you go to like Sermon Central or something, there's a collection of online sermons. You'll see quite a few sermons that are quite, well, bordering on anti-Semitic, that are linking those two texts still. And that's an innovation of Origen, who wanted to make something clear about how he felt about Jewish people back in the 2nd century, and that's just been with us since then. But it's also given us these animals, and that's it's just a really strange and interesting concept. Like, something so simple like that can lead to a 2,000-year long tradition that is, as far as I can see, completely universal. I couldn't find any evidence that there are Christians who don't put those animals there.
On the subject of anti-Semitism, I'm happy to have come across a number of New Testament scholars who are attempting to read anti-Semitism or read the New Testament and remove anti-Semitic interpretations, and I think it's heartening to find that a lot of these interpretations do seem to be foreign to the text, because that was troubling, especially seeing how much anti-Semitism there is in the world today that is doesn't even have the decency to be ashamed of itself anymore. We don't have to camp out there.
Yeah, this is such a difficult topic, and the problem that we have, of course, is that Christianity, by its very nature, is it is something with regards to Judaism. The fact that it needs to exist implies something about Judaism, that leading from, it was completely fallen, if you go for a very problematic stance, to they betrayed God, to it just wasn't as good as Christianity could be. No matter how you look at Christianity, you always end up in some way, because it follows on from Judaism, that people end up in some kind of stance that has a difficult relationship towards Judaism, because it's like following on from Judaism. And this is something that I think really haunts New Testament scholarship, because if you look at the texts, there are some texts that, people are pointing out they've been read incorrectly, but they're also just anti-Semitic or Judeo-phobic, which might be a better term, texts in the New Testament. There's quite a few statements in John that are just extremely harsh. And sure, they can be contextualized, etc., and they are blown out of proportion nowadays by some people. But the text still does seem to say bad things about Jewish people. And by saying things like, well, it's an intra-Jewish conversation, it's Jewish people having conversation with Jewish people, mitigates a bit, but it's still a bit gross. So it's a difficult thing. There's a really good book coming out quite soon now, in a couple of months, about Judeophobia in the New Testament, to be published by Eerdmans. It's a collection of articles by a whole bunch of different scholars, each on different books, and also some on some general things. I contributed one chapter to it, on how to discuss Judeophobia and Christianity in the seminary setting, but there's a whole bunch of other chapters, and that's, I think, going to be quite an important book, because I think it's the first one of its time that really looks at the whole New Testament and some other early Christian texts, and discusses what is the anti-Semitic heritage of these texts, and how can we look at these texts in a different way. Of course, building on a whole bunch of scholarship by other people, but it's collected in one volume. So I think it's called Judeophobia in the New Testament, it's something like that. But I'll just free plug there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Why are you sorry? I
think it's definitely something people should be aware of.
Agreed.
It should be quite affordable as well, as far as I know.
Look, to the tens of people who have consistently listened to this podcast, I will say I think I've made it clear where I stand on that in several episodes. John D. Levinson, Luke Timothy Johnson, like those are just a few of the episodes that
Yeah,
I put out that deal with this, and it's a really serious issue to me,
yeah,
and it only gets more serious. And I don't think public discourse can afford to be polite, and certainly can't afford to turn a blind eye to it anymore. These like the people who are unabashedly anti-Semitic are too bold now, and I think if we get the opportunity, we should smack that down. So I definitely look forward to reading that whole book, but for sure, your contribution to it.
yeah. I don't. I think the book's good. I tried my best with my contribution. Uh,
That's all we can
it's
ask of you.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. So it's coming out in April, and it is called Judeophobia and the New Testament. Um, which and yeah, I think it's. I haven't read all the other chapters yet because I'm waiting to get my actual paper copy because I didn't want to read like a PDF on the screen. But I'm looking forward to it, and I think it's going to be very timely as well with um, yeah, the rise, but also the misappropriation of claims of anti-Semitism that is going on as well, right? So there's also a bunch of things that are not anti-Semitism that are being called anti-Semitism. It's a very complex issue. So I think it's good. Yeah, worked
Yeah,
out well that this book is coming out now because it'll really help us think about some of these issues more clearly.
I hope so. So is there what are the resources, books, blogs, YouTube, podcasts, whatever that you would point people to learn more about fan fiction, early Christian, Second Temple Judaism, any of the areas that you study, and particularly what you emphasize in this book?
Um, I don't really know. I mean, I've my book.
Yeah, guys,
um,
buy this book.
yeah, which is of course unaffordable. But in I think it's six short. No, in November it comes out in paperback, and then it'll be quite quite a bit cheaper. As far as I know, it'll be like somewhere like $25 or $30, which puts it in the realm of affordability. Um, there isn't that much about fan fiction and the Bible because also this is like the first book written about it. And there's been some people like throwing up some ideas, in podcasts or on YouTube, but nothing really like more kind of just like, oh, isn't that a funny coincidence? More than like something that's a bit more academically grounded. So I can't really help too much with that. Um, the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, my suggestion to people is always just go out and read them. There's this world out there that you probably know nothing about. There are translations available online for free. They may not be the best, most recent translations, but that doesn't matter if you're reading them for fun. And the New Testament Apocrypha, you have a bunch of acts of different apostles, the acts of like Peter, and the acts of Philip, and the acts of Andrew, acts of Thomas, and these are just absolutely wonderful stories that show you give you a good idea of like this literary imagination that's going on in early Christianity, that is often hidden to people and helps us just understand things so much better. Same for the pseudepigrapha. So the pseudepigrapha are basically just ones, but then about Old Testament characters. Most people know of Enoch as this kind of mythological thing, and most people have maybe read a little bit of Enoch. But there's much nicer ones out, and my favorite, of course, is the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, which tells about the sons of Jacob that I talked about earlier. That's one that I've done a lot of work with, and it's just full of these fabulous stories and very interesting attempts to discuss very difficult ethics, and yeah, really good times. So I would say go out and read some of these texts, and then if you are interested in them, find some stuff about them.
I think a good non-academic guide is the podcast Apocryphals. Any biblical texts or any text that anyone believes is biblical, they read and discuss.
Yeah, no, yeah. So I'm a longtime listener of Apocryphals, and yeah, they just run through a text and say what they think about it from a very fun point of view. Yeah, and I mean, that's definitely worth listening to. They also just do Bible, like the actual canon, and they do non-canonical texts, and they do hagiographies, etc., etc. It's a good listen, definitely, and very entertaining, especially if you're into things like comic books. There's a lot of comic book jokes added in.
Yeah, they're funny, nerdy guys.
Yeah.
Last question, and thank you for sticking with me. We went over
Mm-hmm.
the time, but what do you read for fun?
Oh, science fiction.
Go on.
I read bunches of science fiction. So right, like just the day before yesterday, I finished Ken Liu's The Grace of Kings, which is epic fantasy about, I want to say, a Southeast Asian culture based, I think, in some way of history. Absolutely, absolutely wonderful. I like dystopias. I read just before that. I read the book Unwind by, who wrote that book? Schusterman, which is quite an old book, but is talking about, became very, very current right now because it's about where the pro-life and pro-choice has led to a civil war in the U.S., and they've reached a compromise which is very dystopian in that once a child is conceived, they need to be born, but then before their 18th birthday, they can be unwound and the body parts can be recycled and given to other people, which is the compromise between pro-life and pro-choice. You can, and is extremely horrific to read, as this way that, well, at least it's not going quite that far.
Yeah,
But was a good mirror on the current events, I think.
so that's a nice bedtime read.
Nice bedtime read. Yeah, I mean, you might feel a bit better about the state of the world once you read that.
Hey, you know what? I guess anything that gets you there.
Yeah.
I'll throw one. I'll throw one your way. I'm on book 3 of a 3-book series. I think it's called the Philosopher Tyrants or Tyrant Philosophers.
Okay.
Adrian Tchaikovsky. I know he's done
Oh, right. Yeah.
some really good sci-fi stuff, and I'm really
Nice.
enjoying this.
Nice.
Okay. Well, Tom DeBrain, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Take care.
No problem. See you.
Thank you so much for listening. Next week on the podcast is Barbara Tita. If you are listening for free, it will be the first of 2 parts. And I'll explain that right now. In our correspondence, scheduling the conversation that we had, Barbara let me know that she prefers shorter episodes. And so I figured on this one, maybe go for a longer overall interview, but then release it in at least 2 parts. And so we got about an hour and a half conversation, and my plan is to release it on the normal Wednesday as the first part, and then halfway to the next episode, the next scheduled episode, which in this case will be my conversation with Catalin Stefan Popa. So between the 2 Wednesdays on a Saturday, I'll release the second part of the Barbara Tita episode, and I'm really excited about that. So here is a quick preview of my conversation with Barbara Tita. And if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Thank you.
Now that gets us to masculinity and femininity. Masculinity is defined really in relationship to femininity, because the worst thing that can happen to a man in the Hebrew Bible is to be feminized, right? I mean, all you have to do is think about the curse of David cursing Joab in 2 Samuel 2, I think it is, or 3, in which he says, okay, Joab's going to be cursed, and the curse will be that his men will turn to the distaff. They'll become women. Jeremiah 51, same thing. If you want to curse men, curse them with being like women, being weak, being, not being warriors. So masculinity, this is a generally highly binary world, though it's not only binary. If we had time, I could talk about where things get murky there. But it's largely a binary world in which masculinity is effectively defined in relationship to the horror of being feminized. The worst thing that can happen to a man is for him to be in the feminized position. All defeated men in the Hebrew Bible are basically equivalent to a raped woman, right? This is how they are seen. So I would say, women exist in order to confirm and to explain male stories. A good example of that I can give you is just the story of Hannah. People go on and on about, look, God gave her a son after all these years of barrenness, how kind of God. But God inflicted this barrenness on her because he had a plan. God makes her barren. It says it in the text. He closed her womb. And Peninnah taunts her more than once with the fact that the deity is the cause of her barrenness. There's no evidence that Hannah did anything wrong. There's no evidence that she's being punished for anything. God just has a plan. He wants that child that she's eventually going to get to be his, and he gets it. She says, if you'll only make me pregnant, I'll give you my son. And all right, now he's got Samuel from the age of about 3 to train, to groom, and to use, right? He effectively makes himself a mini-me, right? That's her body serves his purpose. And that's frequently, I would say, most of the time, what I keep seeing, that femininity only exists for male purposes, right? To define masculinity and to secure masculinity.